Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Hudson Institute. I'm Blaise Mishtal, a fellow here. I'm delighted that all of you joined us for our discussion on Iran's deadly repression and the U.S. response. Delighted to be joined by three excellent panelists who I'll introduce momentarily. But as we have seen over the last several months, what we could call the costs of empire have been coming home to roost for Iran, with increasing dissatisfaction both at home and growing protests that have been met with violent repression in Iran, but also across the region, particularly in Iraq and Lebanon. And to think about both the origins and the future and implications of those movements in the region, but also what that means for U.S. policy, what U.S. objectives should be in dealing with Iran, how the U.S. can and should respond to these protests. I'm delighted to be joined by Mariam Mamsardeki, co-director of Tavana, but a leading, well-known Iranian pro-democracy activist, Tony Bedran from the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, and Mike Duran, a colleague here at Hudson Institute, a senior fellow, and I think one of the most insightful analysts of U.S. Iran policy and strategy over the last several years. So Mariam, maybe I could start with you. If you could give us sort of what is the state of play of the protests in Iran? How did they start? What are they about? How has the government responded, and where are we at today?
Sure. Well, I'll start with where we're at today. The country is in a state of deep trauma. The crackdown on the protests, which were in really hundreds of cities and small towns and neighborhoods and communities. It was a nationwide revolt against the regime. The crackdown was far more violent than anyone had anticipated, and in a gruesome way. Children killed, people shot in the head at point blank range, neighborhoods just completely besieged, people not being able to be taken to the hospital because at the hospital they would just be taken to prison. Families having to pay for the bullets that the regime used to kill their children. Families having to pay 40 million tomans, which is approximately 1 year salary for an average civil servant or factory worker, to get the body so that then they can have a secret funeral. No open funerals. That's the situation. It's very gruesome. We don't know how many people have been killed. It very well could be thousands killed, many thousands abducted. Again, these include children, they include women, they include people who are just passing by, not necessarily, these very rebellious protesters. But again, the protests happened in hundreds throughout the country. Really, the entire country was in revolt. While the protests were happening, the regime shutting off the internet to 80 million people. It may be the first time in world history that something like this happened. Such massive violence coinciding with turning off the internet entirely for a pretty big country. But it's not as though the world didn't know what was happening. The Europeans still had their ambassadors and embassies. There was still video coming out because some of the government ministries and had internet service. People got out the videos of the violence. It's not as though the world doesn't know what's been happening in Iran. It's not as though it's through panels like this that the world can become aware. Even if they don't know anything about what's happening in Iran, they know what this regime has done to people in Syria. They know what this regime is in terms of its nature and what the stakes are. We're at a moment very much like 1988, 89, 90, the Soviet Union falling apart with revolts happening first in its satellites outside of its own borders. And the difference, though, is that the world, especially Europe, doesn't recognize the magnitude, doesn't recognize the potential, doesn't recognize the extremely optimistic and important time that this could be. And how we respond to the violence will make all the difference in terms of whether it's going to be more violent and just a complete disintegration of Iran, or if it's going to be the beginning of a new country, a democratic country, a country that can be a force for peace in the region and the world. So the stakes are very high, as I said. At the same time that, you know, as the regime is coming out from reopening the internet, it's staged protests inside the country. This might be interesting to some of you. So student protesters who are protesting against neoliberalism. Of course, there's no real crackdown on them. You know, making it seem to the world that this is what the discourse is, this is what the demands are. People in Iran are protesting against neoliberalism. It's sort of the new death to America, if you will. So what precedes this is 2 years of intermittent but very consistent mounting strikes, protests, discontent. And who's doing all that? Really, it's like every sector of society, from pensioners to factory workers to truckers to teachers to women's rights activists to students to minorities in very neglected, impoverished areas like Ahvaz, Khuzestan area. The last 2 years has been really Iranians protesting and protesting some more. And then what happened, the trigger, I would say, not the cause, was a hike in the price of fuel overnight, 200%. And it got people out into the streets, obviously. Bigger picture, what's been happening to lead up to this. Internally in Iran, the idea of reform, the promise of reform, has been flatly rejected. And with the slogans that you hear on the streets over the last 2 years especially, this is obvious. The only real people talking about reform are the regime and its echo chamber here in the United States. Okay? Iranians do not talk about reform unless they are going to lash out at the reformists. The anger that is palpable against the reformists is significantly more than the hardliners, because it's been the reformists who, for a long time really, have been making promises, and they've been creating a veneer, a facade that they have never delivered on. So reform is flatly rejected. Corruption has mounted, thanks in great part to the Iran deal. So, you know, as you have people who are teachers not able to put food on their table, working second job, third job, you have regime kids driving around in Ferraris. I mean, imagine somebody driving by in a Ferrari when you, as a teacher, can't afford to feed your family. It's extreme. It's very extreme. Think of Venezuela, and we have a similar situation in terms of the corruption and the divide. And all, but like Venezuela, it's absurd because this revolution was made in the name of the mustazafin, the downtrodden, the people who need help, the poor. And ideologically, the regime is completely bankrupt. I mean, you know, you have still, in 2019, you turn on the TV in Iran, and unless you're on satellite TV, there are people reading from the Quran and telling you about how God has willed the supreme leader to kill people. The disconnect and the immorality, the nihilism is just absurd. And needless to say, this is not a perestroika or glasnost kind of moment in Iran. It's very much a hard, militaristic, really, response to the people. That's the internal situation. I would say that internal situation has almost nothing to do with American policy or the external influences or anything like that. It's the nature of the revolution, it's the structure of that type of regime, and it's the reality of 40 years of failure, which couldn't be anything other than 40 years of failure, given what the Constitution is about and the Velayat Faqih system is all about. Externally, the regime has been emboldened by the Iran deal. There's no doubt about it. I think, like the reformists, anyone who denies that is only sitting in Washington and not looking at the reality of life for people in Syria or Iraq or Lebanon or Yemen. The regime has been emboldened to kill more, to terrorize more, and the nuclear program, I don't know much about nuclear program, but I don't think that has been solved in the way that anyone wants in the West. And so the sanctions have been put on. And so it's really a loggerheads kind of a situation. So what I'm really concerned about is what needs to be the response. We just wrote a petition to the European Union because they have a process for a petition. We asked for certain pressures and penalties on the regime from the Europeans. And it's interesting. Some people who were not willing to sign said, well, the international community didn't even do this for Syria. So how do you expect it to do it for Iran now? But to me, that's exactly the opposite of what we need to be thinking. Because if the international community had done those things on Syria, Syria wouldn't be what it is, and it wouldn't be this excuse for so much cynicism. We have to take seriously the moment that we're in with Iran. We have to penalize the regime. The United States in particular, the Europeans have so much to do because they've done so little, and they're actually going out of their way with Instex and other things to make the regime feel as though you have no reason to fear that we will hold you accountable. You have no reason to fear that with these protests you're in any kind of trouble. That's the European posture right now. So that obviously needs to be corrected, if for no other reason than that the Europeans' own hard security interests are not going to be achieved through this kind of denial about what the Iranian regime is up to and what it plans. Yeah. But America also needs to make very clear, the Trump administration has gotten a lot right. Brian Hook has gotten a lot right, and we're very lucky and grateful. However, on the 26th of December, there will be protests because it's the 40th of the passing of one protester in particular who has become something of a national hero. His mom and dad have become national heroes. His dad called for everyone to come and mourn on the 40th, which is a Muslim, tradition, the 40th day of his passing. The United States must make clear, as it's made clear, for example, in Venezuela, that this day people are going to protest. There will be consequences for you, Khamenei, Zarif, Rouhani, if you crack down. If we see violence, you will pay. We will not come to the negotiating table with you. And the Trump administration needs to make clear what it's going to do and think and push for the long term. I understand that regime change is very much a delegitimized concept, but democracy isn't. Let's speak about the fact that we want Iran to become a democracy. There's nothing wrong with that. There's everything beautiful in that. We want Iran to become a democracy. We don't want a more representative government. This regime is never going to be representative of anything. It's never going to be a normal regime, normal country under their rule. And practical help is very important. The initiative that I started on Instagram, for example, we have about almost 300,000 followers. Almost without exception, the feedback we get from them is internet, internet, internet. We need the internet. If they shut off the internet, they have shut off the movement. And people like Ambassador Grenell have...
if I could just interrupt, is that because they need it as an organizational tool, as a motivational tool? What is the role and purpose of the internet in this movement?
All of the above, but at the very least, when there's human rights violations, it's the only way to get the word out. But it's also for organizing. It's also for knowing what's happening where and when, and it's morale. It's a morale issue too. And so Ambassador Grenell, U.S. Ambassador to Germany, has made some public statements about that we will try to do this, and that's very much appreciated. There are practical things that can be done to provide at least some spotty internet when the regime shuts it down. For example, in Tehran, the British and the German embassies are very close to each other. With strong routers, they could create in neighborhoods internet access. There are also other, like the foreign minister of Israel called on the techies of the world to figure out solutions. If there was ever a time when it was important to figure out emergency internet solutions in the world, this is it. The Iranian people need it. And then I have some other things I can just say later.
Sure. Maybe I could ask you to tell us a little more about the nature and composition of the people who are out in the streets protesting. How representative is it? Is it significantly different than who we saw in the streets, say, during the 2009 Green Movement? Is there a leadership behind this? Is there sort of a well-developed set of objectives and asks, or is it just a venting of frustrations?
Yeah. When you look at the profiles of the people who've been killed on the streets, you get a sense of what the demographic is. And it's about as diverse as I can imagine. You have people with PhDs who've been shot to death. You have people who seem to be laborers. You have them in every part of the country. And yeah, I mean, I can't imagine a more diverse sense of what the Iranian society is. The leadership, with this situation in particular, with such a violent regime, it really benefits a movement to, on the ground, be leaderless, because it allows you to be more adaptive, resilient, decentralized, and less vulnerable to the regime's disinformation, but also just regular old repression, imprisonment. But as far as outside the country goes, obviously, the opposition has a huge responsibility to come together, to be the voice of the people, and no one has done that more effectively than Reza Pahlavi, who is the son of Mohammad Reza Shah, the last Shah before the revolution. He has a huge following, and I should add that of the most popular slogans over the last 2 years have been Reza Shah Ruhat Shad, which means Reza Shah, bless your soul. Reza Shah is like the Ataturk, the grandfather. And many slogans that are asking for Reza Pahlavi, the current prince, to come back to Iran.
And one last question. We occasionally hear that there are also slogans in these protests about sort of no to Iraq, no to Syria, no to Lebanon, right? Invest at home. I mean, how much do Iranian activities abroad and the money that goes to that figure in the dissatisfaction and figure in people's understanding of why they're suffering at home?
It's huge. It's huge because they hear the numbers, the billions of dollars, the fact that this Iran deal was sold to them by John Kerry and Javad Zarif and all that as being something for peace, and it's just been money funneled into the killing of innocent children in Syria. The slogans since 2 years ago even have become more, have increased in number and intensity about this issue. In particular, the Palestinians, I've noticed a few new slogans since 2 years ago focused on basically to hell with the Palestinian people, because this is ridiculous. We can't eat at home and hear all this money is going to them.
So Tony, turning to you, and maybe this sort of the same question about the state of play in Iraq and Lebanon, where we've had protests for months demanding political change, at least in part in reaction to the perception of Iranian presence and control of the politics there. Catch us up to speed on what's going on and what the current state of play is.
Sure. And first of all, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. And so I want to draw some similarities between what's going on in Iraq and Lebanon, while also noting their very specific dynamics in each of the countries. So just on a broader level or a structural level, so Iraq and Lebanon represent the two political orders in the region that show sort of the success of the updated Iranian revolutionary model as exported in the region, right? So you have which is what? So you have two sectarian political systems, and you have in them a very strong holistic export of the IRGC in Hezbollah in Lebanon and its various sister organizations in Iraq. And these organizations then take over the state structures from within, and then they dominate the state structures. So then the political orders in both countries become de facto dominated by Iran. So even when you're not, in Iraq, for instance, the protests have been explicitly anti-Iran. So there's attacks on Khamenei, there's attacks on the various militias that are known to be pro-Iranian and so on and so forth. So there's resentment because of economic tension, because of Iranian goods or the perception of Iranian benefiting or using Iraq to launder or to try to escape some of the sanction pressure that the United States has levied. So that aspect is much more present in Iraq than it is in Lebanon, but just because it is not as explicit, it doesn't mean that it's not there, because there is an understanding and an acknowledgement that the dominating force of the political order is an Iranian instrument, okay? So those things are the commonalities on that level. The other two things have to do with the state of corruption in both countries. Now, these things have to do with issues that are irrelevant to or predate Iranian interference, but it doesn't mean that they're not that they're not actually connected to Iranian interference. So you have these political systems in both Iraq and Lebanon that are sectarian based. So you have patronage systems that are based on sectarian quotas, which gives rise to political elites. And these political elites, whether or not they're directly connected to Tehran, become all invested in the political order and part of the political order that reinforces the political order, which is to the benefit of Iran. So in the case of let's say in the case of Lebanon, you have the Sunni Prime Minister Hariri and his movement. You have various Christian parties, some openly aligned with Hezbollah, some not. It doesn't matter, because they and the various business tycoons that they are allied with benefit from the system as is, and that reinforces the Hezbollah dominance of that political order. So that's very important to start with, to understand why then the nature of the revolts in both these countries, that they are not led by political parties, neither in Iraq nor in Lebanon. For instance, in Lebanon in 2005, you had a series of demonstrations after the assassination of Hariri, the father, the prime minister at the time. But those were led by the actual sectarian political parties. In this case, you have a leaderless movement by people who are demanding the ouster of everybody. We don't want anybody there. And you have a very similar sentiment in Iraq, even though in Iraq, the geographic span of the protests is less widespread than it is in Lebanon. In Lebanon, it's across the board in all of the sects and in all of the regions. In Iraq, it's interesting precisely because it's predominantly in the Shiite areas that are rejecting the Iranian model, if you want, in their country. So even though you have riots that are based on economic grievances, that does not mean that there's a dichotomy between that and the political order. Quite the contrary. And there's another kind of element of commonality between Iraq and Iran and Lebanon, that these pro-Iranian political orders are also connected economically with each other through precisely that kind of corruption and money laundering, where you have business elites, the same business tycoons that I'm talking about in Lebanon that are allied with the political elites. They're also doing business in Iraq, and they're also making money in Iraq. And they're also, whether directly through Hezbollah-linked networks, which are prevalent in Iraq. For instance, if you're familiar with the name Adham Tabaja, for instance, the Tabaja network in Iraq, it's a Hezbollah financier, prevalent in Iraq. Hezbollah's man in Iraq, Mohammad Kawtharani, for instance, has been sanctioned by the Treasury Department specifically as a facilitator of the Tabaja network. So you have the militia, political, and economic aspects are all linked. They're not separate. So there's a holistic order that Iran has in Iraq and in Lebanon. And that order is what's being rejected as a whole by both in the people in Iraq and in Lebanon. The response of the Iranians of the Iraqis with the Iraqi authorities with Iranian influence in Iraq has been to go to lethality much quicker and in a much more escalated way than what happened in Lebanon. In Lebanon, Hezbollah has tried to break up, Hezbollah and its allies, by the way, not just Hezbollah, have tried to break up these protest movements through intimidation, but it has not yet escalated to the type of shooting that you've seen in Iraq, specifically assassinations, of activists, of leading activists, and so on. That has not happened yet, at least in Lebanon. You have seen people coming down with, sticks and chains and knives and some guns, and shooting at people or beating up people and so on. And
what accounts for that difference? I mean, we've seen Qasem Soleimani, the head of Quds Force, go to Iraq and seemingly seem to try to organize the response, but not necessarily in Lebanon. Is that the reason for the difference in lethality, or is it that they think the protests are going to be less successful in Lebanon?
I think there is more caution as to why do you need to sort of get ahead of yourself? If you can maybe wait and see if they fizzle out, maybe if you try to get something in place, like a new government in place, maybe you can try to co-opt. So far, we cannot also discount the element of simply being taken aback by the fact that you have a phenomenon that you're throwing everything at it, and it's still going on. It doesn't stop, right? So, they beat people, they take them out of the streets. They might subside for a while, for instance, as they did in some Shiite areas where the crackdown was most severe. But then they return.
Isn't that ironic? The Shiite areas had to be most severe.
Well, no, because, for Hezbollah, it was very important that the idea that, that there's a challenge to it from within its own areas, that had to be snuffed out. But it wasn't successful. So I think they're trying to see what they can throw at it that would work. And if you go to violence too soon, things might get out of hand, and I don't think they want to go there. So now it doesn't mean that they're not using violence. It's just levels of violence are different. They're using, for instance, again, because there's one thing that's also in common between Iraq and Lebanon, and that is the dichotomy between the state and the militias is fictitious, right? So just as you have both the Iranian-backed militias in Iraq and the state security forces firing at people, and you have the Hezbollah and Amal goons, as well as elements of the LAF and the security forces, municipal police, parliamentary police, which is all fancy names that sound sort of institutional, but in fact mean nothing, right? So these are things that are extensions of the various sectarian parties and their militias. And these guys, so you'll have militiamen basically dressed up in official garb, not as a disguise, because they are part of these security services, beating up people, which is what we saw especially overnight when there's been some very severe attacks. So The other point I want to highlight of similarity between both bases, and this is of importance also in relevance for US policy, is that, as with Iran too, none of these phenomena that we're witnessing in terms of popular discontent and mobilization, none of that would have happened had there not been a financial and economic collapse. So this is an important point, because the policy discussion up to 2 months ago had been that you do not want to destabilize these places. You don't want to over-sanction them, because the banks might collapse, and if the banks collapse, the economy collapses, and then you're throwing out the baby with the bathwater, and all kinds of cliches and so on and so forth. Well, the fact of the matter is that they did collapse, and the result of that collapse has not been what people had said it would be, which is the empowerment of the Iranian elements. Rather, it's the opposite. It's been an attack on the entire order. The Iranian, which is acknowledged to be Iranian-led, but it's not simply targeting Hezbollah, it's targeting everybody. You don't want anybody of these guys in place. So this creates now a dilemma, another dilemma for the United States, beyond the idea of this misguided policy of stability or instability, is that these political orders that I described, the Iranian political orders, these have been the cornerstone of the American position post-2003 in the Middle East, right? The United States in Iraq, and to a lesser extent in Lebanon because it's less relevant, but as a model, it's the same thing, has been that the United States works to prop up the institutions and stability of that order on the understanding that it is an Iranian-backed order, in the pursuit of different priorities. In Iraq, primarily, it was a counterterrorism thing with some residue of the freedom agenda of sort of the democracy project in Iraq, or attachment to the state. But the United States now all of a sudden finds itself in a situation where these political orders are bereft of all legitimacy. That the people are rising to, not to take down this particular party or that particular politician, but the entire order, okay? That's of extreme relevance to the United States decision makers as they formulate a response to this. And the other thing is that it denies you, then you have to start thinking about what tools you need to use in response to it, because we're still stuck in frameworks where we're saying, well, we want to back that guy or this force that is, we think, at least somewhat antagonistic toward Hezbollah or toward Iranian influence. And the people on the street are saying, like, you're not listening, you're not paying attention, that this entire system is rigged and we reject it whole, right? So
on that, let me pivot to Mike, and we've heard from Miriam and Tony that sort of the Iranian imperial project is under stress, and at least part of the reason why is the maximum pressure campaign of financial sanctions that has been pursued by the Trump administration since it came into office, since it withdrew from the Iranian nuclear deal. Was this the sort of pressure that the administration was imagining Iran to come under? Are we equipped to capitalize on it? Was this an objective of U.S. policy? What has the Trump administration been seeking to accomplish with Iran?
Great, thank you. Well, I'm in total agreement with everything that Miriam and Tony said, and I'll just kind of reframe, I think, their insights and say that this is I think in one respect, it's a vindication, a very powerful vindication of the Trump administration's approach. But at the same time, it also, I think, highlights some inadequacies or blind spots of the administration. Let me just start with the vindication, and then I'll get to the blind spots. The vindication is that the administration came in with radically different assumptions than the architects of the JCPOA, the Obama administration, and the supporters. The idea of the thaw in relations with Iran was based on a number of concepts that I think now, which are still alive in our debate, but I think they should just be eliminated. One is that the engagement of Iran was strengthening moderates and reform in Iran. And as Miriam said, there is no reform. The reform movement is a sham, and you can see that very clearly now. The other idea was the Obama administration, listening to the American electorate, wanted to pull back from the Middle East, and it wanted to then minimize the areas of conflict with the Iranians, and presented the Iranians, and in Europe as well, the Europeans presented the Iranians as partners for stabilizing the Middle East. And they looked at the very complex and disordered world from Baghdad to Beirut, and then they looked at Iran, big stable country, closer to a nation state than most countries in the Middle East, and they thought, gosh, can't we get to some kind of agreement with them, and then we can stabilize the region? Well, you see very clearly this is not a partner for stabilizing anything, and then the third. The third assumption was that we have shared interests with them as well. Shared interests in stabilizing, in fighting ISIS. Shared interests in stabilizing Iraq and creating a good order there. And all of these ideas, I think, are now should be dead. There were also criticisms when the Trump administration came in and instituted maximum pressure. There was a whole line of analysis about what was wrong with that approach. And a lot of the ideas that people advanced in that context have also been shown to be totally false. For example, not to go into great detail about it, but the rally around the flag notion. The idea was if the United States imposes sanctions on Iran that are going to, that will not simply target the regime, but will actually harm the livelihood of the average person on the street. The average person is going to, their patriotic and anti-imperialist impulses are going to take over, and they're going to get behind the regime in opposing the United States. And we see it's not true in Iran, obviously. It's also not true in Iraq, and it's not true in Lebanon. The people out on the street are in Iraq. They are explicitly against Iran and its proxies. In Lebanon, a little bit less explicit, but if you listen closely, it's very clear that they're hostile to Iran, not the United States. Doesn't mean they love the United States, but this, as Tony said, this has really exposed the failures of the whole system. So you have to give the Trump administration credit for that, where credit is due. The Trump administration shared with the Obama administration. There's that line of continuity, and I'll get back to this in a minute because I think this is where the weakness in Trump's policy is. Trump, like Obama, wanted to pull America back from the Middle East. He promised the electorate, just like Obama did, we're not going to have another George W. Bush-style invasion of the Middle East. His idea was different. Obama's idea was we pull back by working with Iran and Russia to stabilize the region. Trump said, no, we still have to contain Iran, but I'm going to work with the traditional allies, Israel, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey, to try to put together some kind of order that can push back against Iran. But the primary tool that I'm going to use for containing Iran is going to be the economic one. And so that has been whenever Trump has been faced with a provocation from Iran in any way, his answer is never kinetic. It's always sanctions. Direct answer to your question, I don't think I could be wrong. I don't think they foresaw this kind of simultaneous rebellion against the Iranian order across the board. I'm very sympathetic to the Trump administration's approach. I certainly didn't see this coming. And this is where I think the weakness comes in, because this is a strategic moment. Things like this just don't happen in the Middle East, where in three countries, everyone comes together with, Tony did an excellent job of describing the nuances. It's not identical. Everyone isn't standing up together and saying down with Iran, but very nearly. I mean, there's in Lebanon where
As close as we're ever going to get.
As close as we're ever going to get. Yeah, and there's a little episode I've been focused on in Lebanon. This television journalist, Dima Sadek, very charismatic, attractive television presenter. She had her phone. She was out going to all the protests and documenting them and highlighting them and sympathizing with them, and she was fired for that from her television station. But then somebody, and everyone understood it to be Hezbollah, stole her telephone, and they did that in order to blackmail her, and also to find out who in the presidential palace and elsewhere, who in the elite was actually working with her to leak information and so on. So to get at her sources and to get at her personally, and this has become a big thing in Lebanon. And she the other day put out a video where she directly, without naming him by name, but with no ambiguity at all, went after Hezbollah's security chief and said, congratulations, you got my phone, right? But and then Hezbollah had a cleric that's very, unmistakably close to Hezbollah, saying that she should basically be killed for her sins, right? So you don't get her saying down with Hezbollah, but if you just go one level of analysis below the explicit words, it's very clear that she's saying, as Tony said, Hezbollah is running the show, and Hezbollah is trying to shut down these protests, and Hezbollah, therefore, Iran. So the weakness here is that the mindset of the Trump administration is not focused on capitalizing on it's the mindset was not prepared for this strategic opportunity, and it's not focused, I think, on how to capitalize it. There's just some ambiguities in the Trump approach that make it hard for them to say, this is our moment. And one is this tremendous allergy that the Trump administration has, starting with the president, I believe, to the idea of regime change. And I mean, there's this hangover from the Iraq War. Regime change is a dirty word, and they don't want to use it, and they don't want to get anywhere near it for fear that they're going to create all of this chaos that we're not going to be able to deal with. So when you see a mass movement like that in Iran of people rising up to throw off the existing order, it's a vindication for the pressure on Iran, but the first impulse of the administration is not, well, how do we take down the regime? It's not the first impulse. It's not the second impulse. I mean, it's quite. I think they're kind of fearful of it. In fact,
should it be the impulse? I mean, to Mike and all of you, yeah.
As just a direct, follow up to what Mike was saying. I was just thinking as he was speaking. It's sort of like a man or a woman, whatever, is trying to woo a potential partner, okay? And just trying and trying and trying. And then all of a sudden, that person says, I love you. And, well, what are you going to do now? I mean, they're ready. They're rejecting what, you thought was the competitor, and they want to be with you. Okay, are you ready? Are you ready?
But is the rejection of the regime the same as saying they want to be with us? I mean,
yes.
I think the fears that Mike was hinting at, right, is that the same reasons we didn't really support overthrowing Assad in Syria is like we don't know who comes next. Or the fears that maybe it'll be the kiss of death if we support these protesters, right? I mean,
this is so misguided.
Yeah.
Sorry, can I?
No, go ahead, yeah.
I totally agree with you. And it's misguided because the United States doesn't need anyone in the Middle East to love it. In fact, the United States can have everyone in the Middle East hate the United States and still achieve America's interests in the Middle East. The strategic interest of the United States in the Middle East is that there not be an Iranian hegemony. That is, And if we get an independent Lebanon and an independent Iraq, and they hate the United States, but they're not under the sole control of a power that is actively hostile to the American order in the world, we can live with that. Now, we're not going to get that anyway. It's not the way it's going to. If Iraq and Lebanon are independent, they're not going to be hostile to the American order. They may not love all things American, but who cares? Can I just add one more little point? There's another weakness in the Trump approach, I think, or kind of blind spot, and this relates more to Iraq and Lebanon than to Iran, and that's that we don't have a ground game. That we just have the sanctions from 30,000 feet, which we see are much more effective than anyone ever would have imagined. But we don't. Our policy is technically a rollback policy, right? Mike Pompeo's famous points that he made, 12 points that he made in was it May of 2018? You go through them, and we're going to drive Iran completely out of Syria. What's the instrument by which we're going to drive Iran completely out of Syria? And we'll drive Iran out of Iraq and so on, get rid of all of these proxies. Well, we don't have any. There's no instrument by which the United States does that. The only power in the region that's actually challenging Iran on the ground in Syria is Israel. Now, the U.S. is supportive of that, so you can give the administration credit for that to a certain extent. But the United States is not there. And you really see this blaze in what you were mentioning, which is that Qasem Soleimani, the head of the Quds Force, who has set up all these militias all around the region and delivered to them precision-guided missiles, he's going back and forth to Baghdad, and he's telling the proxies in Baghdad how to go kill the protesters. He's ordering them to go kill the protesters. Where's the American response to that? And that to me, there should be, in my view, a direct and obvious American response to Qasem Soleimani's trips to Baghdad, and that doesn't exist.
Just very quickly about that point, it's precisely because, I think, because of the point I made earlier. United States policy in both Iraq and Lebanon is predicated on the quote-unquote state as the antidote to Iranian influence, as we conceptualize it as Iranian militias. That's the model we're operating under. So everything that we have in terms of concepts, instruments, everything is geared toward that framework, that you support the state as an antidote to the Hezbollah militias. And that is, it's incoherent because the state is dominated by these Hezbollah militias. So you are actually, you start to think.
Same in Iraq.
In a very sort of it's a very small ball type of game, right? That I want to contest Iranian influence in Iraq and Hezbollah and Lebanon by undermining that particular, corner of that state, trying to push out Hezbollah from that corner through that officer or backing that official. You're still playing in the same sandbox, right? And that's why it's a complete failure conceptually. We're not going to have a ground game because the entire game is premised on propping up the system that everyone on the ground in Iraq and in Lebanon wants torn down.
Just to emphasize what you said, the people that we are supporting as counters to Hezbollah and other Iranian militias don't actually fight against.
No, they're complicit in the same order.
So there's no way that the best you can say about them is that they're holding territory that if they were to disappear, Hezbollah might take. That's the very best you could possibly argue. So we're not actually, we do not actually have a coherent counter Hezbollah, and Hezbollah being the major instrument by which the Iranians are creating all of these militias. That we don't have an actual counter Hezbollah program.
I guess the question is, through people power, is it possible to re-envision, re-establish a new political order And the paradox might be that it could be easier in Iran, that is really a totalitarian, extremely repressive situation. It may be easier to do there because the people are so obviously revolting, and there are no other forces other than the state that can be overthrown. It may actually be easier to create a new political order in Iran than in Iraq or Lebanon, because in Iraq and Lebanon, everything is so, am I right? I mean, intertwined. As you were saying, the state power is enmeshed with all of these potential counters to Iranian influence. So exactly what are the people going to get rid of? Like, how are they going to get rid of all of everything,
Right.
and then how are they going to replace it with something else?
That's the big question. That's the unknown, right? Is like, okay, you have a big expression, unprecedented expression of discontent, cross-sectarian, cross-regional, etc. But nobody really knows how that now proceeds. What comes next? Like, how do you move from this moment to something else? Can you move to something else? That's an unknown. Nevertheless, the United States, I don't think, should be concerning itself so much with that as with the actual continuing of this pressure.
So how do we continue that pressure? How do we seize this strategic opportunity that, Mike, you talked about? The reaction of the administration has been rhetorically to support the protesters and their demands. It has sort of applied its economic sanctions tools in support of them against some of the officials that have been responsible for the violence. But what can we actually be doing? Mariam, you talked about trying to find technical workarounds to make sure that there is some sort of internet access for the protesters in Iran. But what else can we be doing? Do we have sort of the pro-democracy tools and ability to support these groups?
The most important thing, I mean, the internet is very important. The most important thing is for the Iranian regime to believe that they will be penalized if they are violent towards the people. And the United States has plenty of resources at its disposal. I mean, first and foremost, don't go to the negotiating table if there's any kind of violence from the regime.
Can I reinforce that? Because I think that the whole debate between us and the Europeans, between the Trump administration and the Europeans, leading up to this moment when we had this unprecedented series of uprisings, was about how to get into negotiations. And I'm not convinced that the administration, or at least key parts of the administration, are not still thinking that way. And this moment, this strategic opportunity, should make them see that engagement of the regime at this point will send a message, will demoralize everyone in Iran, Iraq, and Lebanon. They're still going to have the protesters are still going to have their agendas, and they're still going to be fighting. But it will be a major disappointment, I think, to everyone who's putting their lives on the line at this moment. So I would hope that the president is not looking at the distress of the Iranians and thinking, aha, now's the time to try to cut a deal, or to try to get them to the negotiating table. And I can imagine Trump having that inclination, because a significant portion of his base, just like Obama's, elected him on a peace and prosperity platform, and he sees himself as a negotiator. He thinks that's part of his brand. He wants to go before the electorate saying, "I'm doing everything I can to make sure we don't get involved in a major conflict." So I think that the elements of the administration were already there. The president's mindset was already there, and there's going to be an inclination to go that way. I certainly hope they don't, because it's the wrong move at this stage.
You saw the Iranian regime release an American hostage just recently. Should we interpret that as an overture to negotiations, an attempt to sort of to relieve some pressure on themselves?
Absolutely, 100%. This is the go-to, going back to Iran-Contra and the arms for hostages in 1986 with Reagan. This is the go-to move of the Iranians when they want to start generating enthusiasm in Washington for negotiations, as they start with the hostages.
Mariam, how are you seeing the Europeans react to this, and is there a possibility for coordination in a joint front? Usually it's the Europeans who are sort of more out front on human rights and democracy issues than the US, generally speaking. Is that the case here?
I don't agree with that. In terms of Iran, for sure not, for the last few decades. They might talk a good game as far as human rights dialogue during the Khatami years or whatever, but the trade interests have always been paramount. And then it's the anti-Americanism, and then it's the cultural relativism, and then it's the apathy. The Europeans have gone out of their way to do all the wrong things when it comes to the Islamic Republic, and especially so since the Trump administration and the pulling out of the JCPOA. What's unfortunate is that the Europeans don't realize that this is against their own hard interests and their own values. They view it all as if they're doing the Trump administration a favor. They're not doing the Trump administration a favor if they're intelligent about what's happening in Iran. There are some European parliamentarians who have been outspoken, who've really been principled. And my hope is that, and now the Magnitsky framework has passed, and that's going to take probably 6 months before it's a real enforceable thing. My hope is that reason is going to prevail, and the Europeans will see that there's no future with this regime. The whole region, as we're saying, is revolting against this regime, and then the Europeans, who are supposedly Europe because they fought against fascism, they're united for a common good, are siding so blatantly with the regime that is fascist.
That, of course, Blaise, you asked what the U.S. can do. Top of the list should be major diplomatic effort in Europe to shift the Europeans on this question, on Iran across the board, not just, but specifically now. There's so much evidence of the brutality of the crackdown. The U.S. can use just its ability to influence opinion around the world. It can use a lot of the information that it has. It's collecting an enormous amount of information about what's going on the ground in all of these places. It could do a much better job simply of highlighting the dynamics and making people in the United States, in Europe, and elsewhere see the dynamics that tie what's going on in Iraq to what's going on in Lebanon. But there has to be, especially with Iraq, it's time to reevaluate. I think there should be a wholesale reevaluation of our policy in Iraq, because what's wrong with it is exactly what Tony said. It's built on this notion that we're building up state institutions and that those are going to work to our advantage in the long run. And the Iranians came up with a method, a very effective method of reaching in underneath and subverting all of those institutions that we built up. But we have put so much blood and treasure into that project, into the One Iraq project. It's very hard for anyone, even Donald Trump, who said that this was a big boondoggle to begin with. It's very hard for the system as a whole to say this was a failure, and we need to now. Our policy in Iraq now has to be counter Iran, which means we have to work with those elements on the ground who are genuinely countering Iran. That means not necessarily working with state institutions. Mm-hmm. It's very hard for the United States to make that shift.
It's taking a gigantic ship and taking it on a U-turn. Yeah.
One of the reasons why this is the case is because also of the strong influence of sort of the counterterrorism agenda in Washington, which I think dominates most of our thinking. And by the way, this also has to do with the Europeans. I don't know, you saw Emmanuel Macron's recent interview where he's redefining what the priority, even for NATO, should be, right? It's Islamic terrorism. And
Islamic terrorism, which means Sunni terrorism.
Sunni specifically, of course.
Not Shiite terrorism.
And their view, which is what the Obama administration's view, which is to a certain extent what the counterterrorism DOD view, is that Iran in this, at best you don't want to antagonize it, or even potentially partner with it. So as sort of the key holder for not having that wave of Islamic terrorism come. So, and then the elements of the Iranian political order take advantage of that. So even someone as measly and lowly as the foreign minister of Lebanon, right, Hezbollah front, can come to Western forums and, or the prime minister for the same, Hariri, the same thing, and say, hey, look, if you if you don't help, if you don't foot the bill and bail us out, hey, you might find a lot of refugees coming your way. So we're the only, dam stopping that from overflowing to Europe. So Europe, I mean, just ends up being, because of its weakness, basically, it just becomes much more interested in underwriting the status quo, which is an Iranian status quo.
So to that really quickly, and then I'll turn to the audience. One of the issues that's been debated specifically about Lebanon is whether the U.S. or the West should cut off support for the LAF, the Lebanese Armed Forces, and whether sort of supporting them creates a counterpart or pressure on an alternative to Hezbollah, or whether cutting off the funding would just strengthen Hezbollah and put the entire country in Hezbollah's hands. An opinion on what the right move there is in the current context?
Right. I want to make sure that the conversation about the LAF is not divorced from this overall framework that I laid out of the political order. The LAF is not an autonomous actor, right? This is not a junta. This is a very flawed instrument in the overall security sector of the country that responds and operates within the parameters of the political order. As long as that political order is an Iranian-dominated political order, what you think you can achieve with the LAF is completely fanciful. It's not going to happen. Case in point, for 12 years of U.S. aid to the LAF, not a single time has the LAF moved against Hezbollah in any meaningful fashion, which then and knowing exactly that that's the case, the conversation shifts in Washington to ethereal, non-tangible concepts of we want to weaken the credibility of Hezbollah. We want to weaken the narrative of Hezbollah. We want to create an alternative. Okay, these sound good, but they're meaningless concepts. They don't actually translate into anything, right? So I'm probably the only voice in Washington has been arguing against the aid, sort of stopping the aid. Again, it's not because of the LAF or whether the LAF is an important thing or the money is a large amount of money or anything like that. It's not the point. The point is it reinforces that flawed concept of American policy that I was talking about earlier, and the flawed frameworks that the United States is investing in the region that are actually not undermining Iranian influence at all. They are actually propping it up.
All right. With that, let's turn to the audience for questions. Why don't we try to take three together? We'll start over here. We have a microphone coming. Then we'll go here and then here. Yes. Please be sure to identify yourself and keep the question brief.
My name's Stan Morgenstein, and I'm retired from Lockheed Martin. My question, number one, thank you, panel. It was very, very educational this morning. The American history in terms of going into countries and taking out governments has been terrible since for many, many decades now. We went into Iraq and we took out Saddam Hussein. We destroyed their military in the process by disbanding them and found the vacuum filled by ISIS, which we helped.
Can we get a question, please?
Yeah, so with that background, I heard you all talk about what's wrong with Iran, and I agree with you. What I want to know is, what are your suggestions? We could obviously send our military in and take out the IRG, take out the Iranian government. What are we prepared to do, and what can we do that actually doesn't just leave the country in total waste? Along with that, Lebanon and partially Iraq.
Thank you. I'll take one more question up here, please.
I'm Peter Humphrey, an intelligence analyst and a former diplomat. I don't think we're going to see anything change until either Artesh or some select portion of the IRGC sides with the people, and that's really bad news. I'm wondering if any of you guys see a route to get to that place. More importantly, we have the technology to establish stratospheric drones, which can assure a link to the internet at all times. And I'm wondering why we don't go there. I can see why the CIA wants to keep its hands off the ground action in light of the Mossadegh history. But putting drones over major cities, assuring internet access, that seems to be in our national interest and could accelerate this process. We have the technology. Why in God's name aren't we using it?
Thank you. And then one last question, I think, over here.
First, thank you all for coming. Very much appreciated. I had a couple questions here around the framework. So my summary is that it looks like the power testing frameworks that are going on are ineffective, right? That's pretty clear. War is a test of power, and when diplomats disagree, they go to war. And when they agree, they choose peace. Can we use a hegemony strategy like we do with China and Russia to force Iran to redirect resources on its current border threats, perhaps 90% of that, and direct the, again, the juntas, the military and others, and then strip them of the ability to project power outside of their borders to a limited maybe 10 to 20% of their total force projection capability. And also impact this network and support network that's been brought up several times that they have. So can we use the hegemony strategy to force a majority of their resources to be focused on their borders and less around projecting that power into places like Syria, Iraq, and other places, because there is only so much resource Iran has.
Thank you. So we had questions about sort of regime change versus democracy support, getting the IRGC to split from the regime and using internet to drones to try to get internet to Iran, and then the hegemony strategy. Anyone want to
I'll start
jump in on any of those?
I'll take on these ones about use of force. I've taken the lesson from the last 3 elections that the American people are not eager for another. This is what President Obama got elected on, and it's what President Trump got elected on. They're not eager for another major military intervention in the Middle East. And I understand President Trump's reluctance to move in that direction, and I take it as a kind of rule of the game now. So I wasn't, just to be clear, I wasn't advocating that we should go for a regime change strategy in Iran. But I think that we should recognize that what the Iranian people are doing on their own is working to the advantage of the United States, and we should do everything possible within those limits to strengthen them and to help them, and do nothing that's going to weaken them. But then, I agree with your idea about making them use resources. We do need to contest them on the ground in their imperial project. That when the things that their military is doing in Iraq, the things that their military is doing in Syria, we can contest them, and it doesn't have to be. It doesn't have to be American forces being the ones who are doing the contesting. I mean, we've already seen the great effectiveness of the Israelis, but the United States can be the strategic. The United States can be the strategic brain behind putting together the regional effort to contest them on the ground. And just today, I saw the Israeli satellite service has put out a picture of a tunnel network that the Iranians are building in Syria, right on the Iraqi border, so that they control the border crossing from Iraq into Syria. The Iranians do, and they can then bring trucks with precision weaponry into Syria, and then they put it in the tunnels where they can't be hit by the Israelis. There should be somebody in U.S. CENTCOM who is looking at this satellite and saying, how do we, the United States of America, make sure that that thing gets blown up soon, and that a large number of Iranians die in the process of making that thing blow up. Now, that should be easy. If Donald Trump got his national security team together and said, I want to make sure that this Iranian project in Iraq and Syria at least stops in its tracks, but preferably I'd like to see it roll back. That's within the capability of the United States to do, and without putting a single U.S. soldier in harm's way. Of course, the argument will be if he were to bring his national security team together and say that, the argument would be, well, the operation won't put American soldiers at risk, but the Iranian reaction to it will. And so therefore we don't want to escalate with the Iranians, so we shouldn't do it. But that aversion to escalation on our part is something that the Iranians are using to advance their project. I mean, the amazing thing, when you look at, take for instance, the assassination of Baghdadi a month ago, or whenever it was, October, when did we do it? I've already forgotten. That's an amazing operation. There are very few countries in the world that can carry out an operation like that. The Israelis are one, we're another, maybe the British, not the French probably, not many more, or the operation to take down bin Laden. We shut down apparently the air defense system of Pakistan, went in undetected, took him out. No American soldiers are lost. This is amazing. And we have, over the last however long, a whole string of these incredible demonstrations of military prowess. And all the while that we've had all of these great tactical successes, the Iranians have taken over the Middle East. So there's this incredible capability we have, but it is never put at the major strategic target, and that's the problem.
So just quickly about the issue of collapse. Okay, clearly I'm not talking about Iran, but in the case of Lebanon and Iraq, for instance, I mean, we're not the ones who are causing the collapse, right? I mean, the places are collapsing under their own weight. So if anything, our position had been to try to prevent their collapse, right? And despite our attempt to prevent their collapse, they collapsed anyway, because there's just, the corruption is endemic, and so I think we have to also, stop and look at that reality of what these places on their own faults and their own weaknesses and so on. So nobody needs to send a single U.S. soldier to Lebanon. In fact, the only U.S. soldiers that have been in Lebanon have been there to prop up the order through training the Lebanese armed forces and so on. Because why? Because it's all guided by this counterterrorism policy. This became very easy, like Mike was saying. It became very, why do we only see it here? Because it's effectively cost-free, right? I mean, you can go and you can, politically, nobody's going to argue with you deploying militarily to fight Sunni Islamists anywhere around the globe, right? So, which is an interesting thing. So the issue becomes then not really the use of force, it's against whom you use force, right? So in this case, there's no problem across the board. But the side effect of that is that there's also an implicit deal that you don't destabilize the Iranian order in these various theater of operations. But in this case, they are collapsing under their own weight. So I know, like, one of the famous buzzwords in Washington, to your point, is the land bridge, right? The idea of the land bridge that links Tehran to the Mediterranean via Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon, right? And everyone has been focused on, well, what do we do in Syria, and should we keep that force in Syria because that's blocking the land bridge? Everybody's having this conversation in all seriousness while the United States is propping up the Lebanese Iranian order and the Iraqi Iranian order. So the two sides of that bridge, you know, the terminus points, we're propping up for them to have the ability to dig those tunnels at the border because they rule the place there. For them to have to link it to Lebanon because Hezbollah rules Lebanon. So now we have a situation not really of our own doing. I mean, the economic pressure campaign certainly triggered it or contributed to it, but where these two terminus points are collapsing. And so the question is, how do you have to then have a mindset shift in Washington away from the counterterrorism framework, away from the state institution building framework, and away from this business of, no, we need to make sure to prevent the collapse of these political orders, even if we're not the ones causing the collapse, right? In the service of counterterrorism or in the service of state building. And then use that to pursue that broader strategic objective that, in the case of Syria, you've completely misconceptualized, you know, and now all of a sudden, how do we turn 50 guys in the middle of the desert into a bulwark against the Iranian land bridge? I mean,
Thanks, Tony.
yeah.
Miriam?
Yeah,
Final thoughts?
I don't have too much to add, except that I think that it's not unreasonable to think that IRGC, parts of it, will join the people because it's not as though everybody in the IRGC is making a whole lot of money or something, that they're just, or that they're so loyal to the regime. And as far as internet solutions go, I just wanted to mention that, you know, I have been since 2005, I was one of the very earliest sort of recipients of a US government grant to promote democracy in Iran in 2005. And I've seen the whole portfolio as it's evolved. There is a lot of money being spent on various kinds of assistance, including technological assistance. And unfortunately, there's, as you expect, I guess it's not uncommon for US government money to be wasted, but a lot of money has been wasted on apps and other technology tools that ultimately either are not used or they're not used towards that goal of democratic development. And it's a shame that we're here now when the people need it most. And yes, there are circumvention tools that allow people to get past the government firewall. But when the government shuts down the internet entirely, well, one, it was a problem that was very well foreseen. It was not like something we couldn't have predicted. There are no real solutions, or there's no will to employ any of those solutions anyway. That's really unfortunate considering how much money has been spent and how much talk there has been of how much the US government has done for the Iranian people in this regard. When we talk about regime change, I mean, I'd rather not talk about regime change. I'd rather talk about democracy. Democracy is regime change as far as, you know, when you're talking about a totalitarian regime, people revolting, transitioning to a new system of government that's democratic, I consider that regime change. But I'd rather use the word democracy, democratic breakthrough, democratic transition. It's not reliant on foreign military intervention. In fact, foreign military intervention is not something that would be helpful for the Iranian people. And I think, as I said before, there are tools, leverage, penalties that the US government and especially the Europeans can be using right now to give practical support and solidarity to the Iranian people and to penalize the regime.
All right, with that, please join me in thanking our panelists. And thank you to joining us today for this discussion. As these events continue to unfold, please stay tuned to Hudson for more events and scholarship on these important issues. Thank you.